By the time the prophet Elijah emerged onto the scene, Israel was no longer the nation it had once been. It had been chosen, delivered from Egypt, guided through the wilderness, and established in a land described as flowing with milk and honey. The covenant was clear. If the people remained faithful to the Lord, they would prosper. If they turned away, consequences would follow. Tragically, the northern kingdom had drifted far from its spiritual foundation. The people abandoned the worship of the Lord. What had once been exclusive devotion slowly became divided loyalty, and divided loyalty eventually turned into outright rejection. Idolatry crept in gradually, first tolerated, then normalized, and finally celebrated. The worship of Baal became widespread. Baal was believed to be the god of rain, storms, and fertility, an appealing figure in an agricultural society dependent on seasonal rainfall. Instead of trusting the Lord who had delivered them, the people placed their hope in a false deity fashioned by human imagination. This shift was not merely personal, it became institutional. Systems were established to promote and sustain this new religious order. Places of instruction arose where Baal's myths and rituals were taught to the next generation. Children grew up learning stories that replaced the mighty acts of the Lord with legends of pagan gods. What had once been a covenant community shaped by divine law became a culture reshaped by idolatrous narratives. The political system also deteriorated. Leadership no longer reflected justice, humility, or obedience to divine law. Corruption spread through governance. Power was used to consolidate influence rather than to serve the people. Taxes increased, infrastructure projects expanded, and outward prosperity may have seemed visible, but spiritually, the nation was hollow. The moral compass of leadership was broken. Instead of guiding the people toward righteousness, the throne led them deeper into rebellion. At the center of this decline stood King Ahab. The biblical record portrays him as one of the most wicked kings in Israel's history. He did not merely continue the sins of his predecessors, he intensified them. Under his rule, idolatry was not a private compromise, but a national policy. Ahab built a temple for Baal in Samaria, the capital city. This was no small shrine hidden in a remote corner. It was a public, political statement. By erecting a temple to Baal in the heart of Israel's governance, Ahab institutionalized false worship. He constructed an altar and promoted sacrificial rituals that directly violated the covenant established through Moses. The nation that had once heard the commandment, "You shall have no other gods before me," now bowed openly before another deity. His policies extended beyond religion. Ahab increased taxation and pursued ambitious building programs. While some projects may have strengthened the kingdom economically or militarily, they came at a cost to the common people. The burdens grew heavier. Yet the king's appetite for expansion and prestige did not diminish. Power became both his tool and his obsession. Ahab's ambition was not simply political, it was spiritual rebellion. By aligning himself with Baal worship, he challenged the authority of the Lord. In a culture where kings often determined national religious direction, his personal apostasy dragged an entire nation with him. His reign represented the climax of accumulated disobedience. Israel was no longer drifting, it was sprinting away from its covenantal identity. If Ahab institutionalized idolatry, Jezebel intensified it. As the daughter of the king of Sidon, she brought with her not only political alliance, but also religious zeal for Baal. Her influence over Ahab was profound. Through her, Phoenician religious culture penetrated Israel's spiritual core. Jezebel did not merely tolerate Baal worship, she aggressively promoted it. She supported and protected Baal's prophets, granting them official status and resources. At the same time, she sought to eradicate the prophets of the Lord. Many were killed by the sword, others were forced into hiding. The voice of truth was systematically silenced while falsehood was amplified. Her actions were not random cruelty but strategic consolidation. By removing the prophets of the Lord, she removed spiritual opposition. By elevating Baal's prophets, she normalized idolatry as state religion. Israel's covenant heritage was being dismantled piece by piece. The cultural shift was equally significant. With Jezebel came the customs, rituals, and worldview of Sidon. Worship practices, moral norms, and social values were reshaped. The nation's identity was no longer rooted in Sinai, but influenced by foreign ideology. At this point, sin had reached its peak. Idolatry was nationalized. Truth was persecuted. Leadership was corrupt. The people were spiritually lost. The covenant had been broken repeatedly. The stage was set for divine intervention. God was preparing to act. Into this atmosphere of darkness stepped an unlikely figure, Elijah. Unlike kings raised in palaces or priests trained in institutions, Elijah came from Gilead, a rugged mountainous region east of the Jordan River. It was a land of wilderness and shepherds, not royal courts. His origins were humble, almost obscure. He lived a secluded life, shaped more by solitude than by politics. The wilderness formed his character. In isolation, faith deepened. Elijah was known as a man of prayer, one who stood before the Lord. His authority did not come from title or lineage, but from communion with God. While the nation was being shaped by Baal's prophets, Elijah was being shaped in hidden places. His calling was not self-appointed, he was chosen by God. In times of crisis, God often raises individuals from unexpected places. Elijah did not emerge from the system, he confronted it. His strength lay not in numbers but in obedience. Elijah's first recorded action was bold and direct. He appeared before King Ahab and delivered a declaration that shook the kingdom. "As the Lord, the God of Israel, lives, before whom I stand, there shall be neither dew nor rain these years, except by my word." This statement was more than a prophecy. It was a theological confrontation. Baal was considered the god of rain and fertility. By announcing a drought, Elijah was issuing a direct challenge to Baal's supposed authority. If Baal controlled the storms, let him send rain. If he was powerless, the drought would expose him. In an agricultural society, the absence of rain meant disaster. Crops would fail, livestock would perish, economic collapse would follow. Elijah's words targeted the very domain Baal was believed to govern. The drought would not merely be environmental, it would be revelatory. With one sentence, Elijah confronted a king, a queen, a false religion, and a nation in rebellion. The battle lines were drawn. The God of Israel was about to demonstrate that he alone governs the heavens. The silence of the sky would soon speak louder than any prophet. Elijah's bold declaration before King Ahab marked the beginning of a national crisis, but it also marked the beginning of a deeply personal journey of dependence. The prophet who had just stood fearlessly in the royal court would now be led into isolation. Divine confrontation would be followed by divine concealment. After delivering the prophecy of drought, Elijah did not remain in Samaria to witness the king's reaction. The word of the Lord came to him with specific instructions. Leave this place, turn eastward, and hide by the brook Cherith, which flows into the Jordan. There, he was told, he would drink from the brook, and ravens would bring him food. The instruction required immediate obedience. Elijah had just proclaimed that no rain would fall. Now he was sent to depend on a diminishing water source. The brook would sustain him, but only temporarily. The drought, he announced, would affect him as well. God did not exempt his prophet from the consequences of national judgment. Instead, he promised provision within it. At Cherith, Elijah entered a season of hiddenness. The once public prophet became a solitary figure by a quiet stream. Each day followed a pattern shaped entirely by divine arrangement. He drank from the brook. Morning and evening, ravens brought him bread and meat. There was no marketplace, no cultivated field, no stored grain. Only daily provision, delivered by unlikely messengers. The choice of ravens is deeply significant. In the Mosaic Law, ravens were considered unclean birds, yet God used what was culturally regarded as impure to accomplish holy purposes. This demonstrated divine sovereignty over all creation. Nothing is outside God's authority, not even creatures dismissed as unclean. He commands them, and they obey. The provision was also daily, not excessive. Elijah received enough for each day, morning and evening. There is no indication that the ravens delivered surplus supplies for storage. The prophet could not accumulate reserves for security. His survival depended on the faithful repetition of God's promise. Each sunrise required renewed trust. This season was a classroom of dependence. The man who confronted kings had to learn to wait for birds. The prophet who declared drought had to trust for a single meal. Cherith became a place where faith was refined, not through spectacle, but through routine obedience. Eventually, as the drought intensified, the brook dried up. The water that had sustained Elijah gradually disappeared. Even in divine provision, change occurred. The drying brook was not a failure of God's promise, it was part of his process. Elijah's faith was not meant to rest in the brook, but in the one who provided it. This episode teaches a profound truth. When the world enters crisis, God knows how to preserve those who trust him. Protection does not always mean exemption from difficulty. It means provision within it. Elijah still experienced thirst, isolation, and uncertainty, yet he was sustained. It also reveals that God's methods often defy human expectation. Who would imagine ravens as caterers for a prophet? Who would predict survival beside a shrinking stream? Divine strategy rarely aligns with human logic. God delights in demonstrating that his resources are not limited by conventional systems. At Cherith, Elijah learned that obedience precedes understanding. He did not negotiate the location or question the method. He went, he stayed, and he trusted. In the silence of the wilderness, faith matured. The hidden season prepared him for future confrontation. When the brook dried up completely, the word of the Lord came again. The place of provision had fulfilled its purpose. God's guidance did not end when circumstances changed. Instead, a new direction was given. Elijah was instructed to go to Zarephath, a town in Sidon. This was foreign territory, the homeland of Queen Jezebel. The prophet of the Lord was sent not to a faithful Israelite household, but to a Gentile widow in the land associated with Baal worship. This command was unexpected. If drought exposed Baal's impotence in Israel, Why send God's prophet into Baal's territory? The answer reveals divine sovereignty beyond national boundaries. The Lord was not merely the God of Israel, He ruled over all lands. The journey itself required courage. Elijah traveled through drought-stricken terrain, crossing into foreign soil. The one who had confronted Israel's king now entered the domain of a hostile culture, yet obedience carried him forward. At the city gate, Elijah encountered a widow gathering sticks. Her appearance reflected hardship. The drought had not spared Sidon. Scarcity marked her life. When Elijah asked for water and bread, she responded with painful honesty. She possessed only a handful of flour in a jar and a little oil in a jug. She was preparing one final meal for herself and her son. After that, she expected death. There was no exaggeration in her words. Famine reduces hope to fractions, measured in handfuls and drops. Her situation embodied absolute insufficiency. No hidden reserves, no alternative plan, no visible future. Elijah's response was startling. "Do not fear. First make me a small cake and bring it to me, and afterward make something for yourself and your son." This was not exploitation, it was a test of faith. The request required the widow to act against instinct. In famine, survival begins with self-preservation. Yet she was asked to give first. The promise followed the command. The jar of flour would not be used up, and the jug of oil would not run dry until the Lord sent rain upon the earth. The sequence was deliberate. Obedience preceded visible evidence. Faith is often measured not by abundance, but by willingness to give in scarcity. The widow had to decide whether the word spoken through Elijah was trustworthy. She obeyed. From that day forward, the flour did not run out, and the oil did not fail. The miracle was quiet but continuous. Each time she reached into the jar, there was enough. Each time she poured from the jug, it supplied what was needed, not excess, sufficiency. There was no overflowing granary, no public spectacle. The miracle operated at the level of daily necessity. Enough for bread, enough for survival, enough for tomorrow's need. The drought continued outside, but provision continued inside. This miracle reveals a pattern consistent with Cherith. God sustains day by day. Provision aligns with dependence. When supply appears limitless, reliance can fade. But when provision matches need precisely, faith remains active. The miracle also demonstrates that divine blessing crosses boundaries. A Gentile widow in Sidon became the recipient of covenant faithfulness. God's grace is not confined by geography or ethnicity. Finally, it affirms that faith opens the door to divine intervention. The widow's obedience activated the promise. Had she withheld the first portion, the story might have ended differently. Instead, her trust transformed scarcity into sufficiency. From royal courts to wilderness brooks, from isolated ravines to foreign households, the narrative unfolds with increasing clarity. The Lord alone controls heaven and earth. He withholds rain. He commands ravens. He sustains widows. And in every setting, he teaches the same lesson. Trust precedes provision, and obedience invites miracle. The miracle of flour and oil had sustained the widow's household through the famine, but the story was not yet complete. Provision in scarcity was powerful, but now the narrative would confront something even more devastating than hunger. It would confront death itself. After some time, the widow's son became severely ill. The text suggests that his sickness worsened until there was no breath left in him. The child died. For a widow in the ancient world, This was more than personal tragedy. It was the collapse of her future. Her son represented survival, protection, and hope. Without him, she faced utter vulnerability. Grief quickly turned into confusion and accusation. In her anguish, the widow confronted Elijah. "What have you against me, man of God? Have you come to remind me of my sin and cause my son's death?" Her words reveal a heart wrestling with guilt and fear. In times of loss, people often search for hidden reasons. She interpreted the tragedy as divine punishment. The woman who had witnessed daily miracles now stood shaken. Faith built in provision was now tested by loss. The God who had filled jars was now silent before death. The crisis escalated from material need to existential despair. Elijah did not argue with her grief. He did not offer shallow explanations. Instead, he responded with action rooted in faith. "Give me your son," he said. He carried the lifeless child to the upper room where he was staying. Isolation once again became the setting of divine encounter. There, alone with the child, Elijah cried out to the Lord. His prayer was raw and personal. "O Lord my God, have you brought tragedy even upon this widow with whom I am staying, by causing her son to die?" His prayer was not detached theology, it was relational appeal. He called upon "my God." Then Elijah stretched himself over the child 3 times and pleaded earnestly, "O Lord my God, let this child's life return to him." The physical act symbolized identification and intercession. 3 times he persisted. This was not mechanical ritual, but fervent supplication. The prophet who had commanded drought now begged for life. The man sustained by ravens now depended entirely on divine mercy. His authority before kings was matched by humility before God. The Lord heard Elijah's voice. Breath returned to the child. Life re-entered his body. The silence of death was broken. The drought had demonstrated God's control over the skies. Now this moment revealed his authority over life itself. Elijah carried the living child back downstairs and presented him to his mother. "See, your son lives." The words were simple, yet they carried immeasurable weight. What famine could not destroy, what sickness had claimed, the Lord restored. This was the first recorded resurrection in Scripture. It marked a new dimension of divine power revealed through Elijah. God was not only the provider of daily bread, he was the giver of life beyond death. The widow's response was transformative. "Now I know that you are a man of God, and that the word of the Lord from your mouth is the truth." Previously, she had obeyed in uncertainty. Now she believed in conviction. Provision had sustained her body. Resurrection convinced her heart. The truth of God was no longer theoretical. It was proven through encounter. From national drought to private resurrection, the narrative reveals a consistent message. The Lord alone reigns. He governs rain, commands creatures, sustains households, and restores life. If this message has encouraged you, consider subscribing and following this channel so you won't miss the next part of Elijah's story, where he will confront the prophets of Baal in a dramatic showdown that will shake a nation. Share this teaching with others so they too can discover how faith in the living God transforms crisis into testimony.